Hello neighbors, it's Brad here at eTrailer, and today we're taking a look at the GSP line of axles for ATVs, UTVs, and handlebars. And these are going to be a great option if you have an axle that's on its way out making noise, or you completely destroyed it and you need to get back on the trails. This is going to be a quick and easy way to be able to do that. And I'm also going to walk you through how to get one installed. They are pretty easy to do, so don't let it scare you off. On ATVs, UTVs, or really any off-road vehicle, these are used for work, play, and a little bit of everything in between, but it's pretty common that people are abusing these. And when it comes to what transfers power from the transmission to your wheels, your axle is the connecting point. So if you're hearing clicks or knocking noises, or you're just kind of getting slop as you accelerate, a lot of times that's going to be the wearing down of the universals inside of the boot of your axle. And that's going to translate again to noise, but also it's not going to transfer power, and the potential of it breaking is high. So as a lot of UTV guys go out and about, a lot of times they'll bring extra axles because you can replace this, and the GSP axles are a great replacement because they are slightly stronger than your OEM, and it's going to be a pretty easy direct swap in, and then you can be out on the trails. So really at the end of the day, an axle is going to be pretty similar to the one you took off, just a little bit higher quality and a little bit more heavy duty. And the main thing is you're back out on the trails being able to do whatever you want to do. Looking at these side by side, they're pretty comparable. Things that I see on the GSP over the OEM that I like: you have a wider band where your boot goes. They're all Ottinger style clamps, so they snap in place. They're not going to become loose. But having a wider band means that it's more surface contact on that housing. You can also see rotation-wise, it's really smooth. This is older, it's pretty loose, and that's kind of normal. But the bellows that you see throughout the boot, this means that there's going to be more mobility. It's going to flex its entire lifespan, so the more it flexes, the chance of that boot breaking becomes higher. This allows for a lot more flexibility, and it's got more points to where it's going to allow for that without breaking down. Most of the axles that I've replaced on my own vehicles were because a boot popped open, and then you get water and corrosion, and it breaks that down. And that's a lot of times where you're going to find axle failure. So having nice boots and a good clamp to keep it in place is going to be key. Now these are the HD axles, so they're a little bit heavier duty. Side by side against your factory ones, it looks about the same, but these are going to be generally a little bit more heavy duty. They do offer OEM replacements that are going to be a direct comparison to these. These should be a little bit more heavy duty. There's also a long travel version, so if you have aftermarket suspension that widens out your track, those are available as well. Now, while we're going to be doing just the rear on this, the front axles are going to be almost the same when it comes to the installation. You are going to have tie rods associated that are attached to the hub, but other than that, it's very similar. The concept is there. The first thing I'm going to do while we still have it on the ground is get the lug nuts loose. So I'm going to be using a thin wall socket just because it's tight here, and just kind of get them knocked loose a little bit so we can get this off without it spinning. The next thing we need to do is chock our front tires, because as we raise up the rear, we're going to want to make sure it's not rolling away from us. Now we need to raise up the rear to where we can get the tire off the ground. And so if you have a hitch receiver or on the rear suspension, find a nice solid point to where you can put a jack and raise it up to where you can get a little bit of space underneath the tire. I'm also going to raise mine up high enough to put a jack stand underneath here just to get us added security. We don't want anything falling on us. That jack stand will be there to support us just in case it was to shift. That way we don't have this falling down on us. Now we'll get our lug nuts taken off and we can set our wheel and tire aside. Next thing I'm going to do is get our caliper taken off. It's just going to be 2 bolts that attach it. And on ours today, it's going to be a 15mm socket or a ratcheting wrench in this configuration. So we'll just take these out. Now, from the factory, these have thread lock, but it shouldn't be too terribly tight, but it threads into this bracket, so just get those bolts removed. And you might want to grab a zip tie or a wire to be able to hang your caliper up, and that way it's not going to be just hanging itself by the line. This one does have a clamp that holds it in place, but we want to support that caliper. And this will just slide up, and I'm just gonna run a zip tie through where our hardware was and attach to the arm. Give yourself a little slack, but again, making sure it's just not dangling from that brake line is gonna be key. So what I'm gonna start doing is loosening up the hardware. So there's a few things we're gonna tackle. We have the castle nut or the axle nut that attaches this onto our hub, but we also have the hub assembly that's attached to the arms. And you don't have to remove both. I found that I did the other side on this. It's a lot easier to just get the whole hub taken out. But what I wanna do, just to keep it easy and everything kind of still attached, is loosen all of this, and then we can remove as we go. So to loosen up our axle nut, you'll need a set of needle nose pliers, and we're gonna get the cotter pin taken out. So just bend this to as straight as you can so you can pull it out from the other side. And a lot of times these can be tricky to pull out, but what I do is put the end of the needle nose pliers or even a pick and use that to kind of help. And with another set of pliers, you can kind of bend those tabs in and you should be able to get this cotter pin taken out. To get our axle nut knocked loose, you probably want a breaker bar or some leverage here. It can be tricky as I am kind of lifting up the entire side by side as I do this, but once you get it to go a little bit, I have it loose now. I'm gonna leave it here and I'm gonna loosen up our hardware. And I'll be taking this lower bolt out where it attaches to the lower A-arm, and I'll be using a box end wrench and put that on the head of the bolt and then use the socket on the nut side. And again, it might take a little bit of force to get it knocked loose. And the main reason I'm loosening everything up, sometimes you run into issues where bolts don't want to come loose, and I like to get everything to a point where I know it's going to be able to be removed before continuing on and getting ourselves in a situation where we can't get the axle replaced. So this one I've loosened up. I am going to go to the top one and get that loosened up as well. So now that we got everything loosened up, we can start to get everything removed. So we'll get our castle nut taken off. There's also going to be a washer. You will get a new washer with your new axle, and we are going to replace that. But if you look at it, it is a slightly conical shape, so it cones in. So make sure when you're putting your new one on that you have it in the proper orientation. You can see that it kind of bows out. That's going to be where the castle nut's going to go back on. So now I'm going to completely remove our lower bolt. And sometimes it depends on your side-by-side. Some of them have suspension that really droops quite a bit. So it might be worthwhile to have a jack underneath the arm to keep it from dropping out. That's not really the case on this one that I found that I needed to, but it kind of just depends on your application. When taking the nut off, there's also going to be a washer. Make sure that you retain that. And all of these bolts and hardware are going to go back, so just make sure that you're holding on to those. You can kind of walk this bolt out. And if it's not coming out easy, what you can do is kind of just take a flathead screwdriver, pry on the head, and then you can get the open end of a wrench behind there, and with a dead blow, just kind of knock that out. But it shouldn't be under too much tension, so we should be able to get this out fairly easily. Now we can get our hub and disc assembly out, and there shouldn't be a whole lot of tension here. Sometimes splines can kind of get corroded and seize up, so if that's the case, they do have pullers for that, but mine was able to come off pretty easy here, as you can tell. And this is where you might want to remove the top, because as you start to kind of get this to a point for the axle to drop out, it gets a little bit tight. And I just prefer to not have it rub on the bearings, but you can do it with just one. But since this is just right here, taking this out just makes it a lot easier. Now to remove the axle from the transaxle, it's actually really easy. You should have a straight shot, and with a pry bar or a long flathead screwdriver, just kind of wedge it in there and use that leverage to pull, and the axle should come out fairly easily. There's just a retaining clip that helps snap that in place that we're fighting against. But once we kind of get a little bit of leverage on there, it should come out fairly easily. And with just a little pop, you should feel that pull out. You should be able to get the rest of the axle out. And now we can set this aside. Now getting this back in place, when we pop that out using the pry bar, this is that clip. And really all you're doing is putting pressure to where this will snap in, and then once it's locked in place, that will open back up and lock it. So that can be tricky sometimes to get your axle to pop in, but it's fairly easy. You're gonna get just kind of a straight shot lining it up with your splines, and sometimes you can use a dead blow hammer to knock it in. A lot of times just kind of shifting it back and forth, you're gonna feel it pop, and then you'll be good to go. You can see where our splines are going to feed in, just to that same spot. Again, just as you're drawing it in, make sure that you have it properly aligned, and then we'll give it a few shoves to get it to pop in. And that was a nice feel of it sliding in. So at this point, we're just going to need to take all of the stuff we took off and put it back in place. So I'm going to take off our new castle nut and washer. We'll grab our hub and make sure that it's in the proper position. So we had our caliper bracket towards the rear. Just make sure that that's the proper way. And then we'll get this aligned. And again, I mentioned that sometimes you want it to not droop. It can put it at pretty extreme angles, and sometimes getting these back in place is tricky, but that's not really the case here. So if yours is maybe, you know, got some long travel or something, keeping that A-arm in place will make this a lot easier. Now getting our hub back in place, don't worry about the splines if they're not centered up here. You can see ours is kind of resting. That's totally fine, because as we put our brake assembly back in place, that's going to keep it all aligned. So I'm just going to loosely put our hardware in place to hold this in. So getting our rotor in place, make sure throughout the whole process you're not touching the brake rotor. That can cause grease on here and really not be good for it. So if you're using nitrile gloves, that's a good option, or just don't touch the rotor through the process. So we'll slide this in. You may have to wiggle it a little bit, but we should be able to get those to drop in and get this to pop through. And it might help kind of moving the axle on the backside. And once you get enough threads on here to where that's kind of through, if you're not able to really push it in much more, that's not a big issue, because when we put our washer and our castle nut in place, that's going to kind of snug everything in and draw it through those splines. But we do have our new washer and our castle nut, so I'll get these in place. And you can see as I'm hand tightening it, it's really drawing in everything, so everything's looking really nice. And then we'll get this torque down. And as far as torque specs, refer to your service manual for the proper numbers. And when you torque it down, you should find that there's going to be 4 different holes. So basically we're going to be passing that cotter pin through. If you are slightly off to be able to not get a pin through, I would just loosen it just a little bit to get one of those to pop that cotter pin. Ours lined up actually really well, so we can grab our cotter pin, get that passed through, and then bend this back over. And at this point, we can torque down our A-arm bolts and get that all snugged up, and then we'll just get our caliper put back in place and thread it on as well. When getting your caliper back in place, you'll have the slide with the 2 pads. You can just spread that out to get that to feed over your rotor. And then what I always try to do on calipers, it'll make it a little bit easier, is get one started and then it'll slide the other one in place. And now that we have everything tightened and torqued down, we'll just get our wheel back in place. I'll start my lug nuts. We'll get this lowered down, take our jack stands and jack out, and then we can get our lug nuts torqued down properly. And that's going to do it really for the installation of your new axle. All you'd have to do is just repeat for the other sides. And as I mentioned, the front might be a little bit trickier just because you'll have steering, but really it comes down to just being able to get that hub out of the axle. So whatever you need to do, it shouldn't be too terribly hard to get accomplished. Now, if you've watched this video and decide maybe this isn't something that you want to tackle yourselves, maybe you don't have the place to do it, the tools to do it, or even the want to do it, you can reach out to our dealer locator to find someone close to you. This is a fairly easy one to do, but I also get it. Sometimes you just don't have the availability to do that. So having someone do it for you means that you can still get out on the trails, and that's the most important part. And also, if this video helps you, or if you use GSP axles and have good, bad, or indifferent views on it, please let us know in the comments. That way we can make these better for you and other neighbors that might want axles eventually. Thanks for hanging out and watching the install. My name's Brad here at eTrailer, and I hope you have a great day.